Welcome. My name is Charlie Plavin. I'm the Oregon Policy Manager for Surfrider Foundation, and welcome to our policy edition on Oregon's marine reserves. Today, we are joined by Cristen Don, Marine Reserves Program Leader from the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, who will be taking us on a virtual tour of Oregon's marine reserves and protected areas. Surfrider Foundation, our chapters and volunteers and activists have been very involved in Oregon's marine reserves since their sort of concept back in the early 2000s when the state of Oregon first started investigating whether this was a good idea for the state. Over the course of about 10 years, we resulted in the designation of 5 marine reserves and 9 associated protected areas. Cristen is in charge of all of those, the science, the monitoring, as well as the outreach and the community engagement around all of this work. So we're really excited to have her talk to you for a few minutes about these marine reserves, how they were created. But really the most fun part of this presentation, I think, will come at the very end, where we will take you on a video tour, both above and below the surface of each of the marine reserves. So without further ado, Cristen Don.
Hi, thank you. And thanks for having me. So as Charlie mentioned, my name is Cristen Don, and I work at the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, and I am the Marine Reserves Program Leader. And our agency and program is responsible for the management and scientific monitoring of Oregon's 5 marine reserve sites. So these are areas out in the ocean that have been reserved for conservation and scientific research. And so the plan for today was for us to dive a little deeper into Oregon's 5 marine reserve sites. Why do we have them? Where are they? How did we get to them? And then I wanted to share with you a little bit about how we study these marine reserves and protected areas. And then wanted to tell you a little bit about a program evaluation that the legislature is requiring that we present in the year 2023, so just a couple years away. And as Charlie mentioned, at the end, then we're going to do a virtual underwater tour where we can dive in to each of the marine reserves and take a look at what's actually underwater and being protected in these areas. I know most of us don't ever get a chance to see what's below the surface of Oregon's ocean waters, and so this is a unique opportunity just for us to take a look underwater and see what Oregon's ocean includes. So just to start, I wanted to acknowledge that marine reserves and marine protected areas have been created all over the world for various purposes. In some places, marine reserves and protected areas have been implemented to protect a certain species or certain habitat, or perhaps to protect a special breeding area. In some instances, reserves and protected areas have been designated to enhance fisheries. But in Oregon, we have a very different purpose. So the marine reserves in Oregon have been designed and placed in order to conserve marine habitats and biodiversity. And then the reserves are to serve as scientific reference areas where we can learn and study more about the nearshore ocean we have here in Oregon. And what we're learning and the data we're collecting from this scientific research is to be used to support other management decisions about the ocean, as well as inform any adaptive management of the marine reserves in the future. And then the last goal is that the reserves were put in places and being implemented so as to avoid significant negative impacts to ocean users and our Oregon coastal communities. So here we have a map of Oregon's 5 marine reserve sites. All of these sites are located within Oregon's state waters. This means that they're all located within 3 nautical miles of land. And these reserves, these 5 sites were over 10 years in the making. Included several planning phases, and that planning included coastal community members and community groups working with state officials to design and place these areas. And they the idea was to site these areas and places and design them to be large enough to provide ecological benefits, but also putting them in areas and making them small enough so as to avoid any significant negative impacts to ocean users and coastal communities. And you'll notice on this map that each of the sites has an area in red, and that's the actual marine reserve portion of each site. And in a marine reserve here in Oregon, there's no extractive activities allowed, which means that there's no ocean development and there's no fishing, either commercial or recreational, allowed in the reserve portions. But you'll also notice that most of the sites have these areas in blue surrounding the core reserve. And these are less restrictive marine protected areas. And in all the marine protected areas, there's still no ocean development allowed, but each of the protected areas does allow some type or level of fishing. And what types or levels of fishing are allowed or not allowed are very specific, unique to each marine protected area. And then this is the year that the harvest restrictions went into effect at each of the sites. So you'll see we actually phased in each of these sites. And this allowed us to collect 2 years of research and monitoring data at each of the site before we put in the harvest restrictions. So our first 2 reserves, Redfish Rocks and Otter Rock, were implemented in 2012, Cape Perpetua and Cascade Head in 2014, and then our most recent and final reserve up on the north coast at Cape Falcon just started at the beginning of 2016. So we'd like to point out that each of Oregon's marine reserve sites is unique. They're different sizes and shapes. They have different biological characteristics and contain different underwater habitats. They experience different types and levels of fishing before they were protected as a marine reserve. And then the coastal towns and communities that are most closely tied to each of these sites have very different demographics and social and economic characteristics. And so what this means is that we're very likely going to see different conservation outcomes and different impacts or effects to communities and people in association with each of these reserve sites. So just wanted to dive in a little bit to how we're studying the marine reserves and protected areas. So on one side, we're studying the ecology. We've created a long-term ecological monitoring program that's allowing us to track and understand ocean changes occurring in the nearshore ocean off Oregon. And we've created this long-term monitoring in effect to do 3 things. One, by collecting this regular information over time, we can get a handle on just the natural variation that occurs in Oregon's ocean waters, right? Some years or some decades are really good for certain species, and then the system changes due to natural variations, and for certain years or certain decades, it's not as favorable for certain species. So this helps us understand just from year to year, or over periods of time, just natural variation in the ocean. And then by collecting these data over the long term, we're also able to track and understand larger scale ocean changes occurring, right? So these are permanent changes, such as those due to a changing climate that our ocean here in Oregon is experiencing. So by collecting this long-term monitoring data, we can start to understand and track what are those permanent ocean changes happening. And then also through this program, we're able to see and differentiate those changes occurring within the marine environment due to marine reserve protection. So we can tease out what changes are occurring because we protected them, i.e. we've stopped fishing in them, versus what are changes that are just part of natural variation or are long-term, larger scale ocean changes happening because of things due to such as climate change. And we're collecting information on the entire marine ecosystem. So this means we're collecting data on fish. It means we're collecting data on shellfish and other invertebrates. We collect information on kelps and other seaweeds. And we're also collecting information on habitats as well as ocean conditions. And to do this, our team at the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife is really focused on using these 4 core research tools. So we use hook and line surveys to collect really great information on fish species that you would most likely find associated with rock habitats. We get really great information on fish and fish sizes using hook and line. And then we use 2 underwater video types of surveys. So we have a remotely operated vehicle, also called abbreviated as an ROV. And this is basically an underwater submersible we can drive around that's got video cameras on it, and it flies around just over the bottom of the ocean and collects video footage. And we're able to get great information on fish, invertebrates, seaweeds, and habitats with this tool. Our other video tool is called a video lander, and it's just a simple drop camera system. So it has 3 GoPro cameras attached to it. We lower it down to the bottom of the ocean. It sits collecting video for 8 minutes. We pull it up back onto the boat. We motor to the next sampling spot. We drop it back down, repeat. And then our 4th and final survey that we're doing as part of our long-term monitoring is scuba surveys. So these are conducted in more shallow, rocky habitat areas of our marine reserves. And again, they're able to collect information on fish, invertebrates, and algae, as well as habitat. And so we started sampling and conducting these surveys 2 years before any harvest restrictions went in at every site. And now we're continuing to conduct these surveys over the long term as we continue to implement the sites. And we do the surveys in the marine reserve, and then we also do the exact same surveys in areas outside of the reserve that are still open to fishing. We call these comparison areas. And the idea is we're looking before and after reserves implementation, both inside the reserve and outside, to see what's changing over time. So what changes are occurring, and are those changes the same inside of the reserve as outside, or are they changing differently? So our research and monitoring is actually occurring at 13 sites up and down the coast. We're conducting these surveys in the 5 reserves, and then also outside of the reserves at 8 comparison areas. So this is a very comprehensive monitoring program up and down the state. And I think it's important to note that we have, it's just 3 staff that are doing all of this work. So it's a very tall order for 3 staff to be sampling at 13 sites using 4 different research tools. I also want to mention that we're studying the human dimensions of the marine reserves. So you may or may not be familiar with the term human dimensions research, but essentially human dimensions research looks at how people use, experience, value, and depend on the natural environment. And for our specific research, we're looking at what are the different ways that people and communities use and are affected by. How do they use the ocean, but also how are they affected by marine reserves implementation? So when a conservation strategy such as marine reserves is implemented, it can have positive changes. It can be, so positive changes may be an increase in tourism dollars coming into local businesses. Or an increase in ocean awareness and an increase in the knowledge of the types of issues that the ocean is contending here off of Oregon. But these strategies can also have negative impacts, such as an increased distrust in government or a loss of income to fishermen. Or it may have a neutral effect, no effect. So we want to understand how different stakeholders are being affected, and if those are changing over time. So our core research questions for our human dimensions research are, One, are people even knowledgeable about the marine reserves? And does that change over time? What are the public's attitudes about the marine reserves? And does that change over time? We also want to know what the economic impacts on fishermen are due to the marine reserves, and what are other significant economic impacts on local communities. And then our final research question is, what are the social impacts of the marine reserves? And if you're interested in learning more about the human dimensions research or the ecological monitoring work that our program is doing, or some of our research partners in academia are doing, I highly encourage you to check out our website at OregonMarineReserves.com. We have the science research tab for you to explore more about the research, or take a look at our resource library on the website. Here we have lots of infographics from our research. We also have our monitoring plans, any reports or journal publications. You can find them in our resource library. And then before we dive into our underwater tour, I did want to mention that the Oregon State Legislature has required that we do a program check-in in the year 2023. And so this program evaluation will be looking at all aspects of our program. So as I mentioned, we do ecological monitoring as well as human dimensions research, but we're also required to do outreach and communications about the reserves and the work we're doing. We're required to engage communities in implementation. We need to make sure that the sites are being enforced and improve in compliance with the sites. And then we develop management plans for each of the sites as well. So the program evaluation will be looking at all those various aspects, and also what have we learned to date from our research and monitoring work so far. And so on this timeline down below, 2010 is when our program was really spun up, and we started the ecological monitoring for our first 2 marine reserve sites. And then you see on the timeline the year that each of the marine reserves was implemented. So that's when the harvest restrictions went into effect. And here we are in 2020. So, most of these sites have only been implemented for a few years now. But next year in 2021, our team is going to be writing a report, what we're calling a synthesis report, summarizing our program. What activities have we done to date, and what have we been learning from the monitoring and research so far? And then we'll be handing our report over to a university, and in 2022, that university will be doing the program evaluation. And then they're gonna need to submit a report on our program to the university with their final report due at the very beginning of 2023. So the reserves, as I mentioned, haven't been in effect too long. This time period is really too short for us to be seeing any ecological changes due to marine reserve protections. But we have a great baseline established from which we'll be able to track and understand future ocean changes. Data and information we are getting from our ecological and human dimensions research is being used to inform other ocean management and policy decisions. And it's also helping us learn a bit more about some kind of emerging ocean issues that Oregonians are very interested in, such as things like ocean acidification and hypoxia. We've collaborated with a researcher on looking at microplastics in the stomachs of rockfish. So again, issues that a lot of Oregonians are very interested in. We're helping provide information to Oregonians. But enough about our program. Let's dive into the actual reserves. And we are going to start on the south coast at Redfish Rocks. And then we're going to work our way up north, ending at the Cape Falcon Marine Reserve. And we'll start the tour looking at a map of each of the reserves, including an underwater habitat map. And then we'll dive into some video that takes us below the surface at each site. So here we are at Redfish Rocks. It was one of our first marine reserves. implemented here in Oregon. The reserve is just 2.6 miles, and then the marine protected area offshore from it is an additional 5 miles. This reserve is located just south of Port Orford and near Humbug Mountain State Park. So this is an underwater seafloor habitat map. So the areas in dark gray are rock habitat. The sand color is sand habitat. The light gray color is gravel or mixed habitat, and then any green is land or islands. So you'll see at Redfish Rocks, we're just showing the marine reserve portion in red, but you'll see that it includes a lot of really great rock habitat. There are kelp beds in the shallow areas of this reserve. This reserve was, before being designated, was very regularly fished by the local fishing community, targeting those fish species that are most affiliated with the rock habitat. Commercial urchin fishing was also very popular at this site, and then some commercial crabbing also occurred here. All right, so now we're going to take a look. So here's above the water at Redfish Rocks, and here we are diving below the surface. So here's some of those kelp beds I was talking about. That's a China rockfish. These are white plumose anemones. These are a couple species of rockfish. Okay, so now we're flying north to the Cape Perpetua Marine Reserve. So Cape Perpetua is the largest marine reserve out of our 5. The marine reserve portion, actually I should mention, so this is located near just south of Yachats and just north of Florence. The marine reserve portion includes 14 square miles of ocean, and then there are 3 adjacent marine protected areas that include another 19 square miles. So here we're zoomed in on just the marine reserve portion. You'll see that the majority of the seafloor habitats here are sand or that gravel mixed habitat, but you'll notice on the western edge, that dark gray, which is rock habitat. So this is a deeper, very isolated rocky reef. There's really no other rock habitat like this nearby. And so that makes this reef actually, it has a lot of diversity on it because it's the only kind of structure habitat around. Now at this reserve, prior to being protected, there was some fishing on this the rock species, the fish species at this rocky reef, but there was this was a very popular spot for commercial crabbing. And the reserve here also includes some of the rocky shoreline in its protections, and the rocky shoreline here has some of the most biologically diverse rocky intertidal communities anywhere in the Pacific Northwest. So that's a very unique feature of this site. Also, this area does regularly experience episodes of low oxygen, also referred to as hypoxia. And we have detected a lowering of pH in these waters. So it also sometimes called ocean acidification. So those are some unique features of this site. And a lot of the terrestrial lands adjacent here are protected, and there's even old growth forest upland of here where there are marbled murrelets nesting who then forage in these ocean waters. So here we are underwater. This is that rocky reef habitat. Lots of different rockfish, That large fish sitting on the bottom is a lingcod. You'll see there's actually some nudibranchs or sea slugs. Oh, those are wolf eels. On the left there is a kelp greenling. There's an octopus curling up back into its rocks. So here's some more of that soft sandy bottom habitat. And it's just on the edge of the rock habitat. So now you'll see we transition back into the rock. Okay, so we're heading further north to Otter Rock. So this is just north of Newport, adjacent to the unincorporated town of, or community of Otter Rock, near Devil's Punch Bowl. And so this is Oregon's smallest marine reserve. It's only 1.2 square miles. It only extends about a mile offshore. So while most of the other reserves extend a full 3 miles offshore, this one only extends about a mile offshore. Take a look at the habitat map here. So there is a fair amount of rock habitat as well as sand at this site, and then a couple of offshore islands. And there are kelp beds found at this reserve. And there's, on the north end of the reserve are some really nice rocky shoreline habitats. Great place to go tide pooling. This area didn't have too much fishing occurring either commercially or recreationally, just occasionally before it was protected. So here's one of the offshore islands at Otter Rock. I love this little crab. This harbor seal is probably why we didn't see too many fish in that video clip. All right, you see the cryptic creature here? This octopus is actually sneaking up on a rockfish in the crevice. The lingcod making a cameo. Some perch fish in the background, as well as some rockfish and a bird. And sand dollars, that's another pretty cool feature at Otter Rock. There are sand dollar beds here. Okay, so further north, just off of Lincoln City, we have the Cascade Head Marine Reserve. So the reserve portion here is 10 square miles, and then there are 3 marine protected areas surrounding the reserve, which encompass another 23 square miles. The Salmon River empties out into the North Marine Protected Area here. And it, as I mentioned, it's just adjacent to the town of Lincoln City. Okay, so here's the underwater habitat map. So you'll see that so this reserve encompasses the northern portion of what's called the Siletz Reef. So that's a really extensive stretch of rocky habitat. That's called the Siletz Reef. Very diverse. So this reserve encompasses that northern portion. So it includes a combination of rock and sand habitat. This area, before being protected as a reserve, was regularly fished by the charter fishing fleet out of Depot Bay, and also a fair amount of commercial crabbing occurred in this area. So here we're at the Cascade Headland looking south. And you might see this white snow falling from the sky, and we do call it white snow, and it's just detritus or organic matter, so fish poop or leftover bits of organisms being devoured by other fish. It's full of nutrients, but it does obscure underwater visibility sometimes. And these are all sea cucumbers, these orange. And these are baby Dungeness crab. Oh, and you'll see there's lasers. Those are on the remotely operated vehicle, so we can get a general idea of how big or small organisms are. Okay, so now we're on the north coast at the Cape Falcon Marine Reserve. So this is just offshore of Oswald West State Park, just north of Manzanita. And here's the seafloor habitat map. So this is mostly a sandy bottom reserve, but in the shallow waters, there is rock habitat. And then in the marine protected area, we have some gravel and mixed habitats. This area had very low fishing for on the rock habitats in this area, but this was a popular commercial crabbing spot prior to being protected. So this is Short Sand Beach, which many of you are probably familiar with. Again, rockfish species. The baby rockfish. Big school. So thanks for joining me on this underwater tour. And Charlie, I didn't know if you had any.
No, thanks so much, Cristen, for that. That was an awesome tour. If you guys want to learn more about marine reserves or protected areas, or check out some cool videos or other photos, where can they find out about that, Cristen?
Best places to look are at our website at OregonMarineReserves.com. We also do have a Oregon Marine Reserves Flickr page, which has some awesome photos and videos that anyone is welcome to use. Yeah, those are probably the two best places.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much. And I encourage folks to check out those Flickr pages, check out their resource library. This was really just the tip of the iceberg as far as some of the amazing things that you can see underneath the surface. We're learning all kinds of amazing and cool stuff at our marine reserves and our protected areas here in Oregon. And we're so thankful that we have great staff leading that group and sharing with us. So thanks so much for being here with us today, Cristen.
Thanks, Charlie.